The knock at the door was sharp and impatient. Malcolm Carter wiped his hands on his worn-out jeans and exhaled. He knew who it was before he even reached for the knob. Standing outside, dressed in an expensive suit that reeked of entitlement, was Richard Holman, the landlord who had been making Malcolm's life miserable for the past 6 months. "Mr. Carter," Richard said, his lips curling into a smirk. "It's time." Malcolm stood his ground, his wife, Denise, appearing behind her with their 2 young children clinging to her legs. Their little girl, Aaliyah, only 5, stared up at the tall, sneering man while her brother, Jamal, squeezed his mother's hand. "We just need a little more time," Malcolm said, forcing himself to stay calm. "I told you, I have the money coming in. I just need a few more days." Richard chuckled, shaking his head as if he had heard the most ridiculous thing in the world. "You don't seem to understand how this works, Carter. You don't pay, you don't stay. I want you out. Today." Denise's voice trembled as she spoke. "Mr. Holman, we've been living here for years. We've never missed a payment before. My husband lost his job, but he's back on his feet now. We just need a little—" "I don't care," Richard snapped, his cold blue eyes flashing with amusement. "The bank doesn't care. You think this is a charity? You think just because you have sad eyes and a few kids, you're entitled to my property?" Malcolm clenched his fists. He had worked hard for everything he had. He had never asked for handouts. He had never expected favors. But Richard had been waiting for this, waiting for the perfect moment to remind them who was in control. "I've already called the movers," Richard continued, looking past Malcolm into the small, neatly kept home. "They'll be here in an hour. Get your stuff and get out." Denise let out a quiet sob, holding her children close. Malcolm felt something in him crack. This wasn't just about money. This was about power, about humiliation. Richard wasn't just evicting them. He was enjoying it. "I'm calling my lawyer," Malcolm said. "This isn't legal. You didn't give us proper notice." Richard burst out laughing. "Oh, please. I gave you all the notice I needed. That lease you signed? It's got a little clause in there. If rent is late by more than 30 days, I can evict immediately. And guess what? It's been 31. Malcolm's stomach dropped. He had skimmed the lease renewal Richard made them sign last year, assuming it was the same as before. He should have read the fine print. He should have known Richard would pull something like this. Richard leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper only Malcolm could hear. "People like you always think you can cheat the system. You think you're owed something, but not this time." Malcolm saw red, but he couldn't lose control. Not now. Richard took a step back, adjusting his suit. "Pack your things. Or don't. Either way, you're out." As Richard strutted down the steps, Malcolm slammed the door shut. Denise collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. Jamal sniffled, trying to be strong for his little sister. "We can't stay here," Denise whispered. "Where are we going to go?" Malcolm's jaw tightened. "We're not going anywhere." Denise looked up, confusion in her tear-streaked eyes. "Malcolm." He grabbed his phone and dialed. The call rang twice before a deep voice answered. "Malcolm. Been a long time." "I need a favor, Darnell," Malcolm said, his voice steady. "And if I'm right, it's going to change everything." Malcolm had been underestimated before, mistreated, pushed to the side. But what Richard didn't know, what he had never even considered, was that Malcolm wasn't just some struggling tenant. He was about to become Richard's worst nightmare. Darnell's voice was steady on the other end of the line. "A favor, huh? You sure about this, Malcolm?" Malcolm tightened his grip on the phone, his eyes fixed on Denise and the kids. "I don't have a choice." There was a pause, then a slow exhale. "Meet me in an hour. Same spot." Malcolm hung up and turned to Denise. "Take the kids to your sister's house. I need to handle something." Denise's face was a mix of fear and uncertainty. "Malcolm, what are you about to do?" He crouched down beside her, taking her hands in his. "I promise you, I'm not doing anything reckless. Just trust me." She searched his face for a long moment before nodding. "Just be careful." Malcolm kissed his children on their foreheads and grabbed his keys. As he stepped outside, the moving trucks were already pulling up, Richard stood on the curb, sipping a cup of coffee like he was watching a spectacle unfold. "Ah, smart man," Richard said smugly. "Finally realizing when you've lost." Malcolm didn't stop, didn't even acknowledge him. He climbed into his car and pulled away, gripping the wheels so tight his knuckles turned white. Richard Holman had no idea who he had just crossed. An hour later, Malcolm pulled into a quiet, dimly lit parking lot. A sleek black SUV was waiting, engine running. As soon as Malcolm stepped out, the door swung open. Darnell Washington leaned against the car, arms crossed. He was a broad, imposing man with a calculating gaze. But Malcolm knew him well, knew that under the hard exterior was a mind sharper than most people gave him credit for. "Didn't think I'd be hearing from you again," Darnell said. Malcolm leaned against the car beside him. "I never thought I'd need to call you." Darnell studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Tell me what's going on." Malcolm exhaled sharply. "My landlord, Richard Holman, is evicting us. Says I broke the lease, but I know he set me up." Darnell raised an eyebrow. "Holman? That name sounds familiar." Malcolm pulled out his phone and pulled up a picture of Richard from property management's website. He handed it to Darnell. The moment Darnell saw the face on the screen, his expression changed. His jaw tightened, his eyes darkened. Malcolm noticed. "You know him?" Darnell let out a slow chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, I know him, and if he's pulling some shady business on you, you better believe there's more dirt on him." Malcolm's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" Darnell's eyes flickered toward the city skyline in the distance. "Let's just say Richard Holman isn't as clean as he pretends to be." He pushed off the car. "Come on. I think it's time we pay someone a visit." Malcolm hesitated. "Who?" Darnell grinned. "Someone who hates Holman more than you do." Malcolm followed Darnell into the SUV. As they drove through the city, Malcolm's mind raced. He had expected to fight this battle alone. But now, it seemed like Richard Holman had more skeletons in his closet than anyone realized. They pulled up to a quiet residential street. Darnell parked in front of a modest but well-kept house. He killed the engine and turned to Malcolm. "Before we go in, let me be clear," Darnell said. "What you're about to hear, it might change everything." Malcolm nodded. "I'm ready." Darnell led the way up the front steps and knocked on the door. A few moments later, it creaked open. A woman stood there, her face wary. She was in her mid-40s, with tired eyes and a hint of suspicion in her expression. When she saw Darnell, her eyes widened. "Darnell?" "Hey, Lisa," Darnell said, his voice softer than before. "I know it's been a while, but we need to talk." Lisa hesitated, glancing between Darnell and Malcolm. Then she stepped aside. "Come in." They entered the living room. Malcolm could see framed pictures on the walls. Photos of Lisa with a young boy. A boy who looked strikingly familiar. Lisa sat down, rubbing her hands together. "I don't know what you want, but I don't have much to give." Darnell leaned forward. "It's about Richard Holman." The moment his name was spoken, Lisa's entire demeanor changed. Her face hardened, and her hands clenched into fists. "That man," she whispered, her voice shaking. "That man ruined my life." Malcolm leaned in. "Lisa, what did he do?" She closed her eyes, as if reliving something painful. "He stole from me, from my son. He pretended to help us, but all he did was set us up to fail." Darnell nodded. "We need proof, Lisa. Something that can expose him." Lisa bit her lip, hesitant. Then, after a long moment, she stood and disappeared down the hallway. When she returned, she was holding a thick folder. She placed it on the table and slid it toward Malcolm. Inside were documents, bank statements, contracts, all with Richard Holman's name on them. Malcolm flipped through the pages, his heart pounding faster with each one. "This," Malcolm looked up, "this is proof of fraud, of illegal evictions, of stolen funds." Lisa nodded. "He's been getting away with it for years." Darnell smirked. "Not anymore." Malcolm felt a rush of determination. "We can take this to the authorities." "To the media?" Lisa hesitated. "Are you sure it'll work?" Malcolm looked her dead in the eye. Richard Holman thinks he can throw people away like they're nothing, but he's about to learn that the people he steps on always rise back up. Darnell stood. I know just the person who can get this in front of the right eyes, but we need to move fast. Lisa clutched her hands together. I want to see him pay for what he did. Malcolm nodded. So do I. As they left the house, Malcolm's mind was already spinning with the next move. This wasn't just about his eviction anymore. It was bigger than that. Richard Holman was about to face the consequences of everything he had done. But what Malcolm didn't know was that Richard was already watching. Sitting in his office late that night, Richard Holman leaned back in his leather chair, swirling a glass of expensive whiskey. His phone buzzed on the desk, and he picked it up. A voice on the other end spoke calmly. Sir, we have a problem. Richard's smirk faded. Explain. There was a brief pause. Malcolm Carter. He's digging. Richard's jaw tightened. Find out who he's talking to, and make sure he stops. He ended the call, his fingers tightening around the glass. If Malcolm Carter thought he could win this fight, he was dead wrong. Malcolm had barely slept. The weight of what they had uncovered sat heavy on his shoulders. He sat at the kitchen table in his sister-in-law's apartment, staring at the thick folder of documents Lisa had given them. Fraud, illegal evictions, money laundering. Richard Holman had built his fortune on deception, and now Malcolm held the proof. Darnell was already making moves. He had called in a favor with an investigative journalist he trusted, someone who wouldn't be afraid to go after a man like Holman. But Malcolm knew better than to think this would be easy. Richard wasn't the type to go down without a fight. As if on cue, Malcolm's phone vibrated. A text from an unknown number. You're making a mistake. Walk away before it's too late. Malcolm exhaled sharply. He had expected this. Holman must have caught wind of what was happening faster than they thought. He stared at the message for a moment before locking his phone. He wasn't backing down. Not now. Just then, Denise walked into the room, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. You been up all night? Malcolm nodded. It's all happening fast. Darnell's setting up a meeting with a reporter today. Denise sat across from him, worry clear on her face. I trust you, Malcolm, but I need to know, are we safe? Malcolm reached for her hand. I won't let anything happen to us. I promise. Before she could respond, there was a loud knock at the door. Both of them froze. Denise gave him a nervous look. Who is that? Malcolm stood slowly, his muscles tense. He walked to the door and peered through the peephole. A wave of unease washed over him. Two men in suits. Stern faces. No smiles. He opened the door just enough to speak. Can I help you? One of the men flashed a badge. Mr. Carter, we need to speak with you. It's urgent. Malcolm's grip on the door tightened. About what? The second man pulled out a piece of paper. We have a warrant. You're under investigation for theft and property damage. Malcolm's stomach dropped. He barely registered Denise's gasp behind him. What? His voice was calm, but his mind was racing. That's a lie. The first man stepped forward. Sir, if you don't cooperate, we'll have to take you in. Denise clutched Malcolm's arm. This is Richard. He's trying to scare us. Malcolm exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to think. If Holman was already pulling the legal card, it meant he was scared. That was the only silver lining. He stepped back and raised his hand slightly. I'm not resisting, but I want my lawyer. The officers exchanged a glance. The second man nodded stiffly. That's your right, but you need to come with us. Denise's eyes filled with tears. Malcolm. He turned to her and cupped her face gently. Call Darnell. Tell him everything. She nodded, her lips trembling. I love you. I love you too. The officers took him by the arm and led him out. As they reached the bottom of the apartment steps, a familiar car pulled up fast. Darnell. He stepped out, his face like stone, and immediately pulled out his phone. Malcolm, don't say a damn word. I'll have a lawyer meet you at the station. The officers shoved Malcolm into the back seat before slamming the door. As the car pulled away, Malcolm stared straight ahead, his heart pounding. This was Richard's play. But Malcolm had one of his own. This wasn't over. Richard Holman swirled his drink in his office, staring at the city lights outside his high-rise. The phone on his desk buzzed, and he answered without looking. Well, a voice crackled on the other end. Carter's in custody. Richard smirked. Good. Let him sit for a while. By the time he gets out, this little crusade of his will be nothing but a bad memory. There was a pause. There's one problem, sir. Richard frowned. What? His friend, Darnell Washington. He's making noise. He's got people looking into your records. Richard's grip on the glass tightened. Shut it down. We're trying, but it's bigger than we thought. Word is, they're going to press. Richard's jaw clenched. He stood, staring out at the city below. If Malcolm Carter thought he could win this war, he was about to learn the hard way. Power didn't change hands that easily. Malcolm sat in the cold interrogation room, wrists cuffed to the metal table. He refused to let fear take over. This was Holman's way of trying to break him. The door swung open, and a man in a cheap suit walked in, carrying a file. He sat across from Malcolm, flipping through pages like he had all the time in the world. Mr. Carter, the man finally said, "You're in a lot of trouble." Malcolm leaned back, unimpressed. "You don't believe that." The man chuckled. "You stole property from Richard Holman, vandalized a unit he owns." Malcolm shook his head. "We both know that's a lie." The man leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Then why are you here?" Malcolm held his gaze. "Because Holman is scared." The man's smirk faltered for just a second. Then the door opened again, and another voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." Darnell's lawyer, a sharp-dressed woman with a fierce gaze, stepped in. "My client isn't answering any more questions." The investigator sighed, closing the file. "Suit yourself." He stood. "But Holman doesn't lose." The lawyer smiled coldly. "There's a first time for everything." A few hours later, Malcolm walked out of the station, rubbing his sore wrists. Darnell was waiting outside. "They had nothing," Malcolm said. Darnell nodded. "But they'll keep trying." Malcolm exhaled. "Did you get the files to the journalist?" Darnell smirked. "I did more than that. It's already moving." Malcolm stared at him. "What do you mean?" Darnell pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. "Check this out." Malcolm's eyes widened as he watched the breaking news report playing on the screen. Richard Holman's face was plastered across the screen, along with bold words underneath. Landlord under investigation for fraud and illegal evictions. Malcolm's heart pounded. It was happening. Holman was being exposed. But before he could even process it, Darnell's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and his smirk disappeared. "What is it?" Malcolm asked. Darnell looked up, his face grim. "Denise just called. Someone's watching her and the kids." Malcolm's blood ran cold. Holman wasn't going down without a fight. And now, he was coming from Malcolm's family. Malcolm's chest tightened. His mind raced as he grabbed Darnell's phone, gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Denise!" he said, his voice low but urgent. "What's going on?" Denise's voice was trembling on the other end. "Malcolm, there's a car parked outside. Same one from earlier. Tinted windows. It hasn't moved for hours." Malcolm's pulse pounded in his ears. He turned to Darnell. "Holman's making his move." Darnell clenched his jaw. "Then so are we." Malcolm forced himself to stay calm. "Denise, listen to me. Take the kids. Go to a hotel. Somewhere crowded. Somewhere safe." Denise hesitated. "Malcolm." "Trust me," he said, his voice firm but reassuring. "I won't let him touch our family." There was a moment of silence, then a shaky exhale. "Okay." Malcolm ended the call and turned to Darnell. "Holman thinks he can intimidate us. That's his mistake." Darnell smirked. Time to show him just how big a mistake that is. Richard Holman was furious. He paced his office, his phone pressed against his ear. "You had one job, to rattle him, to make him back off. And now I'm on the damn news." The voice on the other end was nervous. "We didn't expect him to move this fast. The press, the lawyers." Excuses, Richard snapped. Fix it. He ended the call and downed the rest of his whiskey, his mind scrambling for a way to regain control. That's when his office phone rang. Annoyed, he picked it up. What? A familiar voice answered. Calm, cold, unshaken. Feeling the heat, Richard? Malcolm. Richard's grip tightened on the receiver. You have no idea who you're messing with. Malcolm chuckled. That's funny. I was just about to say the same to you. Richard forced a smirk. You really think this ends with some news reports? I own this city. Not anymore, Malcolm said. Check your email. Richard hesitated before clicking over to his inbox. When he opened the first file, his blood ran cold. It wasn't just the fraud papers. There were emails, hidden transactions, witness testimonies. Everything. The kind of evidence that could destroy him. Malcolm's voice was deadly quiet. It's over, Richard. Richard's mouth went dry. You don't have proof. Try again. You see, I made sure this didn't just go to the news. It went to your investors, your business partners, even the authorities. Malcolm's voice darkened. By now, I'd say they're scrambling to distance themselves from you. Richard's hands began to shake. And then, as if on cue, his phone started ringing again. His lawyer, his CFO, his biggest investor. Panic set in. Malcolm continued. You built your empire on the backs of the people you crushed. But you forgot one thing. Richard swallowed hard. What? Malcolm leaned in, his voice like steel. The people you step on always rise back up. A loud bang at the front of the office made Richard jump. Then another. He turned as his office doors burst open. Several uniformed officers rushed in, weapons drawn. Richard Holman, you're under arrest. The phone slipped from his hand as he stumbled back. Wait, this is a mistake. They didn't listen. Cold metal cuffs snapped around his wrists. His empire, his power, everything, gone in an instant as he was let out of his office. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. His name was now synonymous with fraud, corruption, and greed. And standing across the street, watching it all unfold, was Malcolm. Darnell patted his shoulder. Told you we'd get him. Malcolm exhaled, the weight finally lifting. Yeah, we did. His phone buzzed. A text from Denise. We're safe. It's over. Malcolm smiled. Justice had been served. And just like that, the landlord who evicted a black family instantly regretted it when the truth came out. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more. What do you think Holman's fate should be? Let us know in the comments.